webinar series. In today's webinar series, we have Professor Rachita Gulati, who's the Associate Professor of Economics at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, IIT, Roorkee. She received the Subir Chaudhary Visiting Fellowship in 2017-18 from the Indian Observatory London School of Economics and Political Sciences, London. Her research interests relate to banking and financial institutions, banking efficiency, banking stability, corporate governance, evaluation of financial and social policy interventions, and the efficiency performance of public and private institutions. She has been working and gaining experience in this area for the past decade and a half. She has formulated several mathematical and non-parametric benchmarking models to measure efficiency performance, which she had applied to banks, cooperative banks, microfinance institutions, insurers, etc. She has published more than 24 articles in the top-ranking journals. She is the co-author of the book Deregulation and Efficiency of Indian Banks. She has worked on project studies awarded sponsored by the Reserve Bank of India, State Finance Commission of Haryana, Ministry of Tribal Affairs, and ICSSR, the IMPRESS scheme, amongst others. She is also a member of several national and international associations, including the International Society of Efficiency and Productivity Analysis, the Indian Econometrics Society, the International Corporate Governance Society, the International Econometric Society. Because she has worked on policy issues and she has published in BRG, the Reserve Bank's channel, which interacts with the academic world, we specially invited her to share this research with us and our audience. As you know, Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare focuses on research-based policy advice, and because banking institutions are a great concern, we thought it would be most appropriate to have this presentation today. With this, Professor Gulati, the mic is yours. I invite you to please come and speak to us for about 30-35 minutes. We'll follow it up with a question-answer session, and we intend to wrap up the session in about 60 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So before I start, I would like to thank EGROW Foundation for inviting me to discuss this report on the governance, efficiency, and the soundness of Indian banks in their prestigious webinar series. I acknowledge the contribution of the co-authors, Professor Sunil Kumar, Professor and Dean Faculty of Economics, South Asian University, Mrs. Chinglian, and Assistant Advisor, DEPR RBI, Mr. Rajendra, Manager, DSIM, RBI, and Mr. Prabal Bilantu, Manager, DEPR RBI, Ahmedabad. The topic of today's talk on governance, efficiency, and soundness of Indian banks is quite an intriguing and relevant topic. However, it is an under-researched area as far as the banking firms are concerned. The study is quite extensive. While in today's presentation, I will try to concise and mainly focus on the key takeaways from the study. In the recent years, the regulators, supervisors, and the governments across the world have shown the renewed interest in the issues like the soundness, efficiency, and good governance of banks. The main reason for the underlying renewed interest is the detrimental effects that have been caused due to the global and the local level of the crisis, which were colossal and were largely driven by the poor or the egregious corporate governance practices. There are numerous instances that have been noted in the Western world where the poor governance practices have led to the creation of inertia and hampered the growth trajectory of the economy and brought some fragility to the system. One of such examples includes the example of the Royal Bank of the Scotland in October 2008. The failure of this bank was the result of the weaknesses in the decision-making capabilities on the part of the bank executives and the fellow board of the directors. RBS failure has imposed the large cost to the UK citizens in the form of the unemployment for many and the losses of income and the wealth for many more. In the light of these evidences of the bank failures and the instability that has been caused in the Western world, especially after the global financial crisis of 2007-9, the Reserve Bank of India established the Financial Stability Unit in 2009, incorporating the bank stability as the most desired objective in its broad policy framework. The central banking authorities in the other developing and emerging nations have also brought in this initiative as the desired objective in the broad policy framework. Also, in honorable governor of the RBI, the Mr. Shaktikant Das, in his forward of the Financial Stability Report for the year 2019 has echoed on the significance of the good governance of the banks. The importance of the good corporate governance across the board is the most significant factor that promotes the stability and lift the efficiency of the economy to the fullest potential. This is being stated by our Honorable Governor of the RBI. Looking into the recent concerns that the Indian banking industry has faced are the unraveling of the big ticket bank frauds, money laundering, and the unprecedented exposure of the banks to the increased default risk which has resulted into the NPA crisis. If we look at the statistics reported in the Financial Stability Report of 2019, the Indian banking industry has witnessed a total of the 6801 cases of bank fraud, which amounted to around the 715.43 billions in 2018-19, which specifically the more than half of these frauds have been predominantly due to the advances and the credit related. Publicly available sources reveals that these frauds might have happened either or due to the involvement of insiders or the management dishonesty or ineffective internal or the statutory audit or the violation of laws by the bank officials or failing of the senior management to put in place the effective governance strategy or all. So given that these developments which are happened in the recent past, this promoted the discussion on the weaknesses that might prevail in the existing governance mechanisms for the Indian banks and their implications for the bank soundness. These developments have also served as a wake-up call for the legislators, regulators, supervisors, and as well as the academic researchers to diligently review the level of the governance standards, how well the banks are complied to the existing governance standards, and to examine the role of the governance and efficiency in determining the overall soundness of the banking institutions. So we have conducted this study exactly in this direction and have attempted to address the key research question that do governance and efficiency explains the soundness in the Indian banking industry. Before I move to discuss that how we have addressed this issue of the linking the nexus between or developing a nexus between the governance efficiency and the soundness, I would like to put forward some insights on why bank governance is distinct from the governance practices being adopted in the non-financial firms. The groundwork for the governance in the banks was put forward recently by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision in their guidelines, in their corporate governance, in their report published, report covering the corporate governance principle for the banks. If we look at the non-banking firms, the shareholders are the key stakeholders. Whereas for the banking firms, the stakeholders are not only the shareholders, which constitutes the minority or the majority ownership, whose interests need to be protected through the good governance practices. Rather, the good governance involves the good governance practices should also cover the depositors, creditors, and the general public and taxpayers whose interest or the trust need to be remain intact in the banking system by the managers. So for the banks and the financial institutions, particularly, they face three different type of agency concerns. First, that relates to the management control bias. Second, relates to the expropriation of the minority shareholders. And the third relates to the risk shifting to the debt holders. So as far as the first and the second concerns are, first and the second agency concerns are related, it depends mainly on the sound governance codes. The first concern that basically points to the conflict between the shareholder and the management. Second concern points towards the conflict between the controlling and the minority shareholders, while the third concern relates to the conflict between the shareholders and the creditors. For the third concerns, the concern that relates to the risk shifting to the debt holders, the regulation basically monitors this concern, and which is actually a key concern that as far as the financial institutions, particularly the banks, are concerned. Moreover, the banks are opaque, highly leveraged, and regulated in nature. Therefore, they demand the separate governance framework for the banks. So this has been also endorsed in the literature by the studies conducted by the study conducted by the Harriman and the Hoft in 2013. Therefore, for a banking firm which is committed to the good governance, it should not only focus on the empowered board, but also have a strong internal risk and the audit controls, high level of the transparency and the disclosures, well-defined and the protected shareholders' rights, and rational incentive structure. In the terms in the HOP 2013 also point out that the banks cannot be restrained to the equity governance principles, which more or less relate to the traditional shareholder model, but also should focus on some sort of the debt governance in order to avoid the excessive risk taking. Governance for banks in India, as far as the structure reforms and the policy amendments are concerned, as of 1st April 2020, as we all know, there are 12 public sector banks and the 22 private banks, along with the 44 foreign banks. However, in this study, we have mainly confined ourselves to the domestic commercial banks, and the study basically empirically analyzes the governance practices in the public and the private sector banks. The governance structure for the public sector banks, specifically for the nationalized banks, is governed by the Banking Companies Acquisition and Transfer of Undertaking Acts of 1970 and 80, whereas in the State Bank of India Act of 1955 defines a set of the regulations for the SBI. For the private banks, they are mainly governed under the Companies Act of 1956, which is recently amended in 2013, and broadly based on the entity laws. However, if we look at the governance structure across the public and private sector banks, the differences exist, and these differences have mainly been on the grounds of the composition of the board strength, appointment of directors, board meetings, interlock directorship, CEO and the executive and the CEO remuneration, director's age and tenure. So these differences are further elaborated in the report. I will little confine myself to mainly discuss about the characteristics that these public and private banks holds in terms of these these specific characteristics. So, looking into the reforms and the policy amendments that have been taken up in India with respect to the governance. So institutional and the legal frameworks are defined by the Ministry of the Corporate Affairs under the Companies Act, recently amended in 2013. The SEBI, Securities and Exchange Board of India, under the clause 49, listing obligations and disclosure requirements, also provides the corporate governance guidelines for the listed companies. Most of the banks are already listed on the stock exchange, on the BSE, and falls under this clause 49. Report of the Corporate Governance Committee 2017, Uday Kotak has also provided the guidelines for the corporate governance under the legal frameworks, whereas the initiatives which were taken by the RBI includes the constitution of the Standing Committee on the International Financial Standards and Codes 2000 under the chairmanship of Dr. Y.V. Reddy. So this was the initial committee which was constituted, and the committee recommended the guidelines of the OECD for the corporate governance to be followed by the banks, and have also defined certain norms to be followed by the banks since then. The committee entrusted the task to the advisory group on the corporate governance in 2001, which was chaired by the R.H. Patil. Further, the consultative group of the directors of the banks and the financial institution 2002 was established. More recently, the Committee to Review the Governance of the Boards of the Banks in India 2014, chaired by the P.J. Nayak, the recommendations of this committee has already been in full force and are adopted to some extent by the banks, and banks are to some extent complying to these recommendations. As far as the recommendation of the committee by the P.J. Nayak, the bank's board bureau was constituted for the appointments of the the directors on the boards of the PSB, which is recently renamed as the Financial Services Institution Bureau in 2022, and has extended the scope to include the other financial institutions along with the banks. There are the discussion papers which are also available, which describes the governance practices in the commercial banks to be followed by the RBI, which was released in 2020, and some of the guidelines which are provided in the recent report of basically it is a note a note on the corporate governance in banks, appointment of directors, constitution of committees of the board 2021. So a brief discussion on the governance characteristics on the 4 different dimensions: board composition, structure, and structure. If we look at the board composition and the structure for the and the comparison across the public and the private sector banks, so we note that on an average the bank board in India has the 11 directors, including the executive directors, inside or whole-time directors, the non-executive, affiliated and non-affiliated, and the nominee directors. The public sector banks have as far as the board independence is concerned, the public sector banks has around 40% of the board as the independent, whereas in private banks we can see the number, the percentage is the 64% in 2000 for the study period. While if we look at the statistics for the 2014, it is 69% for the public sector private sector banks. On an average, the board conducts the 12 meetings in a year, with a frequency of 1 meeting per month. And in 83% of the public sector banks, the same person holds. So CO duality is nothing but recently in 2014, there was amendments in the guidelines with respect to the governance code related to CO duality. So earlier the guideline says that this norm was not mandatory, rather it was voluntary, and voluntary for the companies. And the 83% of the PSBs hold the same position. In the 83% of PSBs, the same person holds the 2 positions of the chairman and the CEO on the board, compared to the 18% in the private banks in 2009. While if we look at the recent statistics, it has declined to 14% in 2018 for the public sector banks. With respect to the presence of the women director on the board, the guideline says to have at least one woman director on the board, and there was the better compliance that has been observed across the public and private banks on the appointment of the women director. But if we look at the statistics for the private banks, there is at least one woman director that could be that we have observed on the boards. With respect to the audit committee and the audit function, audit and the risk functions, we note that on an average, the audit committee of the PSB has 6 members, and the committee members met more frequently. And this was evident from the rise in the number of the meetings from the 9 to 11 in 2018. The average number of the independent directors on the audit committee of the PSBs and the PBs is 35% and 81% respectively, and more of the independent directors are appointed on the audit committee of the private bank. Regarding the risk governance, the consultative group of the directors of the banks, financial institutions, in 2002 has recommended that each bank should constitute a standalone board level risk management committee, and accordingly the risk management committee is being constituted. And if we look at the number of the size of the risk management committee, it is around the 5 or 6 directors on an average, whereas the meetings are around the 5 and the 4 meetings for 5 meetings on an average for the public sector banks, and the 4 for on an average for the private banks. In public sector banks, the percentage of the banks having the non-executive member as a chairman of the risk management committee has escalated from the 0% to 47% in 2018. So the statistics with respect to the remuneration committee and the trends in the remuneration practices reveals that only the 64% of the private banks have dedicated remuneration committee in 2009, but the number has increased to 100% since the norm has become the mandatory after this 2014. And every bank has constituted the remuneration committee. However, the mean remuneration, if we compare the mean remuneration across the public and private sector banks, executive remuneration, so this has shown the wide disparity. Bank executives in the public sector banks, they are not entitled for the stock options and the equity grants. So this is actually the main component which brings the wide disparity across the executive pay across in the two groups. On an average, the government ownership in the bank's equity shareholding has increased in the recent year from 77% to the 80% to the 85% around that. So in 2018. For conducting the study, we have collected the data, qualitative and the quantitative data on the 48 governance norms for the individual banks, and the data has been collected from the publicly available information in the corporate governance report segment of the annual reports of the sample banks. The reports were read cautiously, and the data has been collected laboriously for all the different governance norms and the compliance by the banks on the different governance standards. So list of the governance standard is available as an annexure to the report. And if for any missing information, we have sought the details from the corporate governance section of the NSE and the Indian boards database by the NSE. For the construction of the governance, for the construction of the soundness index, we relied on the 14 financial ratio indicators and the framework proposed by the Reserve Bank of India. And the data for these ratio indicators have been collected from the statistical table related to banks in India. So analysis is limited to the domestic commercial banks and are carried out for the period from 2009 to 18. In order to capture the impact of the new reforms and the governance changes, we divided the study period into the 2 distinct periods and have looked into the impact of the reforms and the changes in the governance regulations on the distinct groups and as well as the industry as a whole. Methodologically, the study has used the non-parametric benefit of doubt approach, which is data envelopment analysis based approach in the pure output setting for the construction of the governance and the soundness index. The aggregation is done in the two steps. First step involves the construction of the dimensional indices of the bank governance to understand the evolution of the governance practices across the six different dimensions. So the study covers the 6 dimensions of the corporate governance for the banks: the board effectiveness, audit function, risk management, remuneration practices, shareholder rights and the information and disclosure and transparency. Whereas the computational framework is the multidimensional framework which has been used for conducting this study. The governance frameworks for the banks in this study basically constitutes the 6 dimensions, and the indicators in each dimensions is listed in the report, and in total the 48 governance indicators are used for 48 governance indicators are first aggregated into the 6 dimensional indexes, and then aggregated into a composite index of the bank governance. A soundness framework is based on the 5-dimensional framework covering the asset quality, management efficiency, capital adequacy, profitability, and the liquidity. In the second step, we attempted to aggregate the dimensional indicators to build a composite index of the bank governance. The advantage of using this framework is that the framework provides the endogenously driven weights, and those weights are the bank specific as well as the dimension specific, and help us to identify the policy priorities placed by a specific bank on the distinct dimensions. So indicators which are used for the construction. So in the study, we are more concerned about obtaining the value of this parameter nu k naught, and which is actually indicates the idiosyncratic policy weight and the priority placed by a specific bank O for the constructor specific bank O on the distinct dimensions of the governance, and the distinct dimensions of the governance. Indicators and the dimensions and the dimensional indices which are used for the construction of the bank soundness. We adopt the 5-dimensional soundness framework of the Reserve Bank of India. 14 ratio indicators are used here, and they are integrated to construct the 5-dimensional indices of the bank soundness, and the further aggregated to constitute the bank soundness index. All the ratio indicators are normalized and vincerized to before aggregation, and all the data cleaning and the data handling the procedures are well adopted for before we have constructed the index. For the construction of composite index of bank soundness, we are basically interested in obtaining the WI naught, which represents the idiosyncratic policy weights associated to the distinct dimensions by weight or the priority by the bank on the specific dimension of the soundness. The last 2 constraints, the 7th and the 8th constraint, basically specifies the situation in the construction of the index wherein we have imposed the additional weight constraints in the model for aggregating the governance in the governance dimensions and the model for aggregating the soundness dimension. The purpose of introducing these weight constraints, the additional weight constraints, is that to avoid any sort of the overemphasis or the underemphasis or the ignorance of any policy priority by the bank. Since we assume that all the dimensions and all the dimensions are important for the bank, therefore the weights this additional restrictions have been imposed, constraints have been imposed, so that one or the few dimensions may not get overemphasized or ignored. For the computation of the efficiency, the DA-based model is used, and we have obtained the risk-adjusted alternative profit efficiency scores for the individual banks. So analysis is all based on the bank level data, and the computations for the governance index, soundness index, and the efficiency is done at the bank level. The advantage of this the advantage of using this risk adjusted alternative profit efficiency model, obtaining these risk adjusted profit efficiency scores, is that this model allows us to accommodate the allows us to account for the equity risk along with the undesirable outputs, that is the bad loans, and that we have accounted for in this model. For the purpose of developing a linkage between the governance efficiency and the soundness, we have attempted to use the two-step system GMM method. Robustness tests in the study are performed using the pooled OLS and the panel fixed effects methods. Along with that, we have also explored the varying effects along the distribution of the bank soundness by employing the panel quantile regression as developed by the Powell 2016. The 3 different model specifications have been developed, and the 3 different models have been developed for the estimation purpose, and the specifications have been run across these 3 different models. So the first model basically is used to link the overall governance structure and the bank soundness. Second is used to develop a linkage between the dimensions of the governance and the bank soundness, wherein the 6 different dimensions of the governance are linked to the overall soundness. And the third is used to develop the linkage between the governance indicators and the bank soundness. And we have moved from the aggregated to the disaggregated analysis by using the different specifications. And different hypotheses are tested in the study. The first hypothesis which we have tested is that an effective governance structure and the high profit efficiency promotes the soundness in the banking system. Along with that, the 6 other hypotheses are tested to understand the linkage between the distinct dimensions of the governance with the overall soundness of the banking system. And the secondary hypotheses which are tested to develop the linkages between the individual governance norm pertaining to the board, risk and the audit practices, risk and the audit function, and the remuneration practices. So while explaining the results, so these are the indicators and the overall dimensions and the list of dependent and independent variables used for the analysis. So the overall board bank soundness index is linked to the governance index along with, in the first specification, along with the set of the bank specific and control variables and the dummies. In the second specification, we have tried to link the dimensions of the dimensional indices of the governance with the overall soundness. And in the third specification, we attempted to link the selected governance indicators pertaining to the distinct dimensions with the bank soundness. The results in the discussion are basically looking at the results in the discussion. First, I would like to talk about the evolution of the governance and the soundness in the banking industry. In the study we focused on the evolution at the aggregate and the disaggregated level of the individual ownership groups, and analysis of the optimal policy priorities by the banks on the distinct dimensions of the governance and the soundness. So we note that the average bank in a sample operates little farther from the governance frontier and still needs a more effort to improve the regulatory compliance on the governance and on the governance codes. In the first diagram, the trends in the governance index in the industry and across the ownership groups is presented. We note that the private banks showed relatively superior performance in terms of adherence to the governance codes, and banks were observed to be relatively better governed in the first sub-period, with the difference in the governance levels in the underlying sub-periods that was significant, that has been observed, that has been tested using the adapted leak test. However, if we look at the most recent years with the adoption of the more recent years with the adoption of the new guidelines, the compliance by the banks has improved, and the governance standards have initiated showing the upward trend in the recent years. As far as the bank soundness is concerned, we note that the typical bank still operates farther from the stability frontier and needs an improvement on all the dimensions of the stability and the soundness. Industry remained reasonably stable from the 2009 to 2012-13, before the early signs of the decline in the bank stability started appearing in the year 2013-14, when a severe endogenous NPA crisis knocked the banking system. So we note that amid the internal crisis that occurred in 2013-14 due to the sharp decline in the asset quality, the low interest rate regime on the account of the huge stressed advances, a fall in the off-balance sheet exposure, increase in the write-offs and the loan loss provisioning, Indian banks experienced a fall in their profitability level and increased liquidity stress that significantly endangered the overall stability. However, the private banks has initiated improving the situation in the private banks has initiated improving in the later years of the study period, and nevertheless, the public sector banks still face the greater challenges. As far as the sources of governance under compliance and the policy priorities are concerned, we note that the banks in India appears to be the more compliant with the shareholder rights and the information and disclosure and transparency, which we broadly categorize as the principles relate to the equity governance. Public sector banks are still stumbling in achieving the greater compliance with the dimensions of the board effectiveness, risk management, audit functions, broadly categorized under the debt governance category, and they reported a far lower value for the audit index. Even though if we look at the trends, even though the public sector banks have demonstrated an upturn in the board index in 2017-18, the board quality in the banking group, public sector banking group, remains the major concern and is far below. Governance on the risk management has declined in the private banks recently, especially in the last 2 years of the study period, while the same has improved for the public sector banks, because the public sector majority of the public sector banks has brought under the PCA framework, and which has led to PCA framework and which has led to the improvement in their performance on the risk governance. On an average, a sample PSB has shown, looking into this table, and the reported values of the new I naught that I have shown you in the model which we have used, and we obtained the values of the optimal policy priorities by the different banks on the different distinct dimensions of the governance. So those are averaged and presented here, and the yearly trends are reported here in terms of the priorities placed by the banks on the distinct dimensions. So we know that on an average, the sample PSB assigns the higher sample public sector bank assign the higher priority to the disclosures, which is followed by the remuneration and the shareholder rights and the information in the rights and information. Whereas in contrast, the private banks ascribe a greater importance to the audit function, followed by the risk management and the board quality, and especially in the most recent years, in the later years of the study period, the private bank has placed the greater emphasis on the audit quality and the compliance on the audit functions. For the sources of bank soundness and the policy priorities on the soundness indicators, we observe that the PSBs has witnessed a noticeable deterioration in the asset quality and the profitability, and strikingly did well in the management efficiency. Banks in both the groups behaved almost similar in terms of the liquidity as far as the liquidity index is concerned. An average PSB entrusted the higher priority to the management efficiency, around 55.7% of the emphasis and the priority being placed by the public sector bank on the management efficiency. and paying almost similar priority on the less or the more the same on the other dimensions. In contrast, an average public-private banks put more focus on the management efficiency, followed by the asset quality and the profitability. In the recent years, in the years 2015, 16 and 16, 17, owing to the NPA crisis, the private banks have shifted their focus towards the asset quality and the profitability. While exploring the results pertaining to the nexus between the governance efficiency and the soundness, we have presented the results in the three different subsections. Wherein the first I will talk about the results of the overall governance structure in the bank soundness. Then I will move to the that how the different dimensions of the governance relates to the bank soundness and the selected governance indicators linkage with the bank soundness. So the results are presented in these two tables, and we could see that the results clearly provides the evidence of the time persistence. As far as the lag value of the bank's soundness index is concerned, we note the time persistence in the bank behavior and we observe that if the banking system experiences a jerk in the soundness in the current year, the impact will persist for some time, and the recovery, or we can say retrieving the erstwhile level, will not be the instantaneous, rather it will be the partial. The lack of the observed instantaneous recovery in the bank stability may be due to the presence during the study period, may be due to the presence of the damaging effects of the potential exogenous and the endogenous shocks that the industry has experienced, especially the post-GFC period, global financial crisis period. Some of the prominent factors that can emanate from the shock in the banking system could be the increased risk provisioning and the write-offs due to the enormous volume of the NPAs, low profitability, liquidity stress, decline in the capital buffers and capital buffers, etc. As far as our primary hypothesis related to the governance structure and the overall bank soundness is concerned, so we note that the results reveal that the governance structure predicts the bank soundness in India, and the linkage with the efficiency with respect to the linkage in the efficiency, we note that the more profit efficient banks are sound enough to hold the capability of absorbing the shocks. And this is reflected from the positive sign of the profit efficiency variable with the soundness in the different specifications. And that could be through the dynamic loss provisioning, generating the substantial capital buffers, which can reduce the destabilizing effects. Endogenous shocks to the system in the form of NPAs, as reflected from the crisis dummy, has moved the soundness level below the level observed in the years prior to the crisis. Banks with the larger government ownership concentration and the public sector in nature are far more affected by this burden. If we look at the interaction of the crisis with the public dummy, we note the positive coefficient, and this suggests that the re-regulation process along with the regulatory reforms that was kicked off in the response to the NPA crisis has slightly moderated the ill effects of the crisis as far as the soundness of the PSBs is concerned. Bank expansion through the branch internationalization to some extent has the positive impact, while the coefficient is very small. Array of re-regulation and the new reforms in terms of the amendments in the governance regulation as a response to the hostile events, along with the other efforts taken by the regulators and the government, has slowly begun to push and restore the erstwhile soundness level in the industry. Looking into the impact of the distinct dimensions of the governance and the governance on the soundness, we note that the higher compliance with the audit function, especially after the period of 2014, has had shown a significant impact on the soundness. Better remuneration practices help the board in deciding the compensation packages linked with the performance and lowering the agency conflicts and improving the soundness practices. Higher compliance with the shareholder rights enhances the soundness of the banks. While as far as the disclosure practices are concerned, we note that only the reasonable and the rational disclosures can protect the interest of the minority investors or shareholders along with the depositors and can circumvent the precipitating risk of being unsound in the future. Moving to the last subsection of the results that talks about the selected governance indicators and the bank soundness, we have chosen to perform a regression econometric model. That is a third econometric model with respect to the board characteristics, audit function, remuneration, and the risk. With respect to the board characteristics, we have examined the impact of the board size, independence, meetings, CO duality, committees, women, proportion of the women director. We note that the frequent board meetings offer an opportunity for the quality discussion and a positive influence on the soundness, while the supraoptimal number of the committees brings down the soundness level. As we see, the number of the constitution of the committees in the PSBs has recently increased, and it is around 15 in the PSBs, while in the private banks, it is on an average the 10 to 12 committees. Regarding the effect of the board independence on the soundness, we observe the uneven effect across the ownership groups. While in the public sector banks, it shows the positive impact, while for the private banks, it shows the opposite relation. We do not find any significant impact of the CO duality and the presence of women directors during the study period. In the public sector banking segment, we find the board independence and the soundness decidedly related and shows the positive relation. As far as the audit committee is concerned, we note that the majority of the independent directors on the audit committee assist in exercising the better controls over the bank accounts and the finance, and accordingly, more tight audit functions bring down the danger of the failure. With respect to the size of the audit and the risk committee, we note that the results hint that having an optimum size of the risk and the audit committees will be preferable. Connotation is that an appointment of additional directors on the audit and the risk should be in a way that it will not increase the complexity and rather ensure the diversity and expertise from the various areas and assure the effective flow of the information and the proper risk mitigation. Study supports the agency theoretic view on the compensation that holds in the private banking sector. Compensation that holds in the private banking sector, and the remuneration committee designs a better pay structure, which designs a better pay structure and contracts for the executive and helping the motivating the better decisions aimed at averting the shocks and improving the soundness. The results are observed to be the robust across the different specifications and the alternative estimation methods. Relationship between the governance soundness and the soundness is significant. We are not so specifically if we look at we look at the variations across the distribution, and we found that the governance and the soundness relation is observed to be the more significant and strong at the bottom quartiles, especially for the less and the moderately sound banks. The relationship weakens at the upper quantiles, while we find that the consistent evidence of the governance vanishes after the 75th quantile, and implying that the government enhances the soundness mainly up for the moderately and the low less sound banks. More tight controls. So with respect to the results have been further extended to capture the quantile effects for the distinct dimensions of the governance. So with respect to the audit, we observe that the relation that the better audit controls tend to boost the soundness, whereas for the risk dimension, we note that the relation is observed to be significant for the moderately sound banks. Regarding the compliance with the disclosure practices, the relation appears to be the greater transparency lowers the bank risk of being less sound for the quantiles 50th to 75th. Profit efficiency shows the positive impact on the soundness in all the quantiles. Finally, the study from the study we have came up with the certain conclusions which could be taken as a takeaways. First, that relates to the first, we can say that although the banks in India, based on the findings, we can say that although the banks in India have made the significant progress in adhering to the governance standards over the recent years, the current level of the compliance may not be considered as adequate to mark the existing governance structure as a socially efficient, which could help in mitigating the agency conflicts. So Indian banking industry remained reasonably sound from the 2008-9 to 12-13, before the early signs of the decline in the asset quality and the profitability was observed. And the private banks, no doubt, have shown, by and large, has shown the improvement in their soundness position. For the public sector banks, the situation is still challenging, and the above trend was more pervasive for the public sector banks. There exist noticeable asymmetries in the policy priorities by the banks on the distinct dimensions that I have already indicated separately for both the groups. The private banks demonstrated relatively better performance in adhering to the audit function, risk management, and the board effectiveness. For the profit efficient banks, they are better able to keep up with the capital buffers and help in diminishing the destabilizing effects. So therefore, it is to avoid the risk of the failure in the long run, business practices by the banks should be such that it will assure the sustainable profits. Econometric findings related to the governance and the linkage between the governance and the soundness reveals that the degree of the governance compliance in the banks significantly explains the soundness level, and non-adherence can undermine the stability. An emphasis only on the stringent compliance with the board attributes without due attention to the other important aspects. So as it was already indicated in the literature and has been deliberated in the literature with respect to the equity and the debt governance principles, specifically for the banking firms. So the stringent compliance only on the equity principles and undermining the role of the debt governance standards also is debt governance standards can have the severe implications. So therefore, the study further reveals that the traditional equity governance principles not only determine the soundness, but the compliance with the debt governance principles also assume an important role, particularly in the aftermath of 2014. Thank you.
Professor Gulati, this is too much of hard work. I've gone through your DRG study the day I invited you, but then the amount of work you have put in along with your team is very impressive.
Yes,
I'm going to invite questions from the audience. Please raise your hand and I'll certainly give an opportunity. Professor, before we go further and I invite the audience, I had a few thoughts to share with you. One is, did the skill level of the board members in public sector banks, did you find it makes a difference? Because what is, or maybe when you compared it to the private sector bank, the experience that they brought in, and could anything be done to improve the governance standards in public sector banks? And this could be just one skill level of the board members. The second, the exposure of the whole-time directors in the boards of the public banks. Now, they expect to have some to that effect being taken care. And the third, and this is the last, do you think training of the board members in different aspects could improve the standards of governance in public sector banks? So if you would like to respond to these, and then in the meantime, I'm inviting everyone once again, if you have any question or query or observations, please raise your hand and we have 5-6 minutes. We'll give an opportunity as much as we can to discuss. So, Professor Gulati.
Okay, so very interesting question, Professor. So while collecting the data on the board effectiveness and the different aspects that we have collected for the board, there are around 14 different aspects. So the first aspect which you have indicated is the skills, and the second is the experiences. So we intended to include those aspects, but looking at the different sources, we could not able to find out the complete data set which could actually gives us the information related to the skills and the experiences of the board of directors. While the third point which you have indicated related to the training, yes, it is included, but not the training with in that sense, but we have only included the variable, the training, whether the training is being given to the directors or not. So that is from the perspective of the compliance, that the training is being imparted or not. Although this code, the code on the training to the directors is the voluntary, but still we have included because we consider that this aspect of the training is important for the directors to be included in the analysis. So yes, this is a good suggestion that I will look forward in the future study to incorporate the training as a separate indicator to understand the impact of the training on the soundness level. Sir, you are muted.
There is a question from the audience about the
Yes.
gender of board members, any impact on efficiency?
We have not observed any impact on the soundness, overall soundness of the banking industry, but yes, possibly because the compliance on this presence of the women director is quite recent, and the public sector bank have earlier there was relatively less number of the banks which could show the presence of the women director on the board, but now with respect to the compliance with this norm, the banks have initiated appointing the women director. Possibly, maybe with the future data set, and we could see some impact, but right now in the study, we have not been able to capture any impact of the gender diversity.
My own feeling is like the co-educational system versus the single gender. Co-educational system generally comes out with better, well-trained children.
Yes.
So maybe the gender diversity in the board will be a big help. I
Yes.
have generally seen that women have played a very good role in financial inclusion, and there are studies which show that their behavior towards financial world is far more responsible. So there is a possibility that that could show us
Yes.
a positive impact. Now there are a few more questions which have just come in. Would you like to take one or two of them? See, there is how can we see the governance and efficiency with respect to RRBs, which are very nearer to the larger section of rural population, and how will it help in rural financial inclusion? And then I had another related question, Professor Gulati. You see, our public sector banks and private sector banks, they have a unique characteristic. Our public sector banks are far more diversified. They carry far more social responsibility on their shoulders. And you must have seen, because your study covers 2014, you must have seen that they played a very important role in Janta.
Yes.
In sharp contrast, the private sector banks that you have in the sample, they are generally metropolitan driven. They generally like to have the creamy business, and generally they are least bothered about social responsibility. They will do something which fulfills the some criteria, but not much. Would you think in your research a distinction to that effect would have a different impact?
Right now, we have not thought of from that perspective. Maybe in the future study, we could look at this aspect. But as far as the challenges which we have observed for the public sector banks, it was quite higher relative to the private banks. Moreover, if we look at the dual regulation of the public sector banks, that is the major concern which we have observed for the means like the due to which they have been observed to have the lesser compliance, but they are relatively doing better now in terms of adhering to the norms. So we will definitely try to look at this aspect, that how it could be captured. The first question which was asked related to the regional rural banks, in this study we have not accounted for the regional rural banks, because if we look at the capturing the data availability of the different indicators of the governance, it was quite challenging for us. So regional rural banks is quite a vast group, and this could be taken as a separate group for understanding the governance issues in this particular segment. Thank you.
Any other questions anybody would have? And also, Professor.
Yes, sir.
When you did do the study on the NPAs and the board decision, did you cover two things? One is the one-time settlement and the recent policies, especially after the bankruptcy code came in. Did that make a difference?
No, that has not been explicitly covered. But as far as the regulatory changes which has been brought in due to the settlement process and the bankruptcy code, we tried to capture it through the regulatory dummy.
Mm-hmm. And you placed the regulatory dummy at which point?
We have placed it at 2014-15.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Professor, one more question I have. You know, there has been a bulge in the NPAs of the public sector banks.
Yes.
And you know that the bulge basically happened because public sector banks do large lending, something which a private sector bank, as I mentioned, would not. They would prefer a creamy one and a short one and a quick one. But when it comes to infrastructure lending, it is generally the public sector banks which have an exposure. Now, my question is that within the public sector, some banks have the skill to do the viability of a huge, longish infrastructure project, while other banks don't. So generally, the banks would take one as a lead bank and the others will join the bandwagon, saying that the lead bank is such an important bank. Now let's join them and therefore we are safe.
Yeah.
Now, did you see any distinction between the performance of the lead bank and the banks which were following? Means if I had to take the public sector banks as two categories, one which had served as a lead bank, and these are the major banks. Means I don't have to name them like the State Bank of India, PNB, Bank of Baroda. They are just ones which have been treated. Make the best of it. So did you see any distinction in the performance if we divided the cohort in this manner?
No, right now we have not divided, but this is an interesting question that you have posed. We were also asked about this question by one of the reviewers when we were conducting the study. But due to the time constraint, we could not able to take up. But definitely, this is a really an interesting question, and we would like to take up and categorize the banks maybe as the highly capitalized or low capitalized, or highly profitable or low profitable, or high NPA generating or low NPA generating banks, and see the linkages. So that is actually a new arena, and we will definitely look forward to take up this.
There's a question from the audience asking about recent policy of RBI to give licensing to corporate sector. Any effect on the present structure? I do not know if you would like to respond to that.
I really can't see that how it will be linked.
Mhm. I think, Professor, we must thank you. We have already exceeded the time limit. Maybe you have to run for another class. And we want to thank you for agreeing to come on our EGROW and share your extensive research, such a rich research. As it is in the country, there is a shortage of good banking research, and you have contributed so extensively in this research. We want to thank you for being with us and having accepted our invitation. With this,
Thank you, Professor, for.
I would also like to mention that next Friday, on October 7, we have Professor Dev Bhattacharya, who's from Bangladesh, and he's going to be speaking to us about the economy of Bangladesh. And you know that Bangladesh is a very important country these days. So I was wondering, what is the economy of Bangladesh like? And so we have invited Professor Dev Bhattacharya to speak to us on the economy of Bangladesh. I would welcome all of you to please join in that session. The timing of that session is little different. It is from 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. So the session next week is from 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. The topic is the economy of Bangladesh. So we'll get a bird's eye view on different aspects of the economy. With that, let me thank each one of you for enriching the discussion today and being with us. I want to once again thank Professor Rachita Gulati from IIT Roorkee to have agreed to share this important research, extensive research on Indian banking with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.